couple of weeks ago, I began my 6th year teaching at NYU Steinhardt. I started teaching there in September 2020, smack dab in the middle of the pandemic. I was so grateful for the job, especially given that I was working solely as an independent voice teacher at the time, and for obvious reasons, all of my work dried up. I've been reflecting on these last couple of years, and I have to say I'm even more grateful to be adjunct voice faculty at Steinhardt. And I want to be clear, I'm not trying to earn brownie points. I don't suspect that my viewership is so wide that my colleagues are actually watching or listening to this podcast. If you are, hello. I'm just being honest with you. It's a really great job. I feel appreciated for my contributions, and I am inspired by the students I have the pleasure to work with and collaborate with every semester. But I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that everything is peaches and cream. If you're watching this, it won't surprise you that teaching is hard work. I mean, it always has been. And if we look at the continued attrition in our profession, especially since the pandemic, I think we could argue that it's not exactly getting easier. I was recently reminded of just how difficult our jobs can be when I awoke out of a sound sleep at 3 a.m. one night after a particularly grueling day of teaching, and I failed in every attempt to get back to sleep. My mind was racing with too many thoughts, all of them school-related. So I finally got up at 5 a.m. and dove into work. And thankfully, I had time in my schedule to take a nap later that day. You know, if you're like me, you may have 20 years or more left in this vocation. And even if you have less time than that, I'm sure you may be wondering with the rest of us, how do we make this teaching thing a sustainable practice? How do we minimize the costs of what we do and connect or reconnect with the joy of our work? Hi. My name is David Sisco. My pronouns are he, him, and you are so welcome to this podcast, Wholehearted Voice Pedagogy. I'm glad you're here. This podcast is an extension of my book of the same title, which was released by Routledge Press this past July. You can find it on Amazon, Routledge.com, and anywhere books are sold. So today, it's just you and me. It's a challenging time to snack a guest, so I thought maybe we could use this time to talk about practicing self-care. I'm happy to share some personal stories along with the research and resources that are buoying me as I stare down the barrel of a very hectic semester. Now, hopefully we're all still feeling pretty good. I mean, most of us are just a couple weeks in. We recently started back to our institutions or our independent studios in the last couple of weeks. But what I've learned is that I have to really be proactive in my self-care routine in order to keep the, what I call, lava flow down. Because if I don't, I have nights like the one I described earlier. Or I might find myself feeling reactive to a student's expression of frustration. I want to quell these kinds of experiences by operating from a more regulated place as much as I can. So let's get into it. Right after this little musical amuse-bouche. As we all know, teaching is a stressful profession, but let me share some research which illustrates some specific reasons why that is so. First, we are a vulnerable profession because we are often not fully in control of our work conditions or outside demands. And a teacher's judgment, no matter how pedagogically sound, can always be challenged by a higher authority. You may have heard me share this painfully true quote by Joseph MacDonald. There is no escape. Vulnerability is the fundamental condition a teacher finds themselves in. It's a great quote. Secondly, we deal with many different kinds of stressors. One researcher described teacher stress through the creation of what they called the earthquake model. The epicenter is evolving accountability reforms and testing measures. The main shock is teacher evaluations, tenure, and school rating. Aftershocks might be increased workload and uncertainty, and normal job stressors include administrative duties and lack of administrative support. Finally, because of the kind of one-on-one work we do, we are more prone to compassion fatigue and even vicarious trauma. We are interacting with many different individuals' nervous systems on a given day, and some of those nervous systems have experienced trauma. Research has proven that vicarious trauma, quote, can occur in professionals who work in high stress and trauma exposed fields, but it can also affect civilians who do not work in high trauma fields but are deeply impacted by the stories that they are exposed to. I think that's us. In short, other people's nervous systems impact our nervous systems. How could they not? And are we aware of the cost of such exposure? Maybe. Maybe not. Do you know your own personal warning signs that indicate you may be in need of some self-care? I don't mind sharing a laundry list of mine. And here we go. Rumination. That's a major one for me. I start overthinking or creating narratives about situations I'm encountering that are not in any sort of way based in facts or reality. Intrusive thoughts while I'm teaching, proof that I'm not practicing mindful presence. I may find myself starting to feel reactive to stressors rather than responsive to them. Acid reflux, yep, that's one, because I'm often not mindfully eating, but kind of just shoving food into my mouth while I'm watching TV. Insomnia, see above. These are all signs that I'm probably operating outside my window of tolerance, a subject that we discussed with my wonderful colleague, Marcia Lesser, in episode 5. As explained by Dr. Dan Siegel, the window of tolerance is a place of social engagement where we can freely think and express ourselves because we do not perceive any outside threats. When in this place, we are regulated and at ease. When we go outside the window of tolerance, we tend to either go to hyperarousal, which is fight or flight, or hypoarousal, which is shut down or freeze. The list I shared above suggests that I tend to go toward hyperarousal. And if you tend to feel yourself being depressed or shut down, you may tend toward hypoarousal. As Deb Dana writes in her book Anchored, leaving regulation isn't the problem. In fact, the goal is not to stay in a state of regulation, but rather to know where we are, recognize when we're moving out of regulation and being pulled into a survival response, and be able to return to regulation. So, if you find yourself raising your voice to a student or colleague or withdrawing from your community, it may be a sign that you are outside your window of tolerance and that you're in need of a little self-care. In the book, I share a story about a time when I was not at my best in the voice studio. My student Caleb Ajao, a fantastic tenor, was kind enough to allow me permission to share that story in the book and anywhere else I wanted to. And so I wanted to share it with you here as well. Here's a video of me talking to Caleb about that incident.
So a couple months ago, when David and I were working on a new song from Porgy and Bess for my recital, it was the first time that we were working with a new accompanist. And it was the first couple minutes, 5 minutes of tackling the song. And there was a lot of issues with notes and rhythms, which led to...
Yeah, I think I said to you something along the lines of, I don't know if this is the best use of our time right now, given that we have your pianist. Why don't we take a look at this when you know it better? And as soon as I said that, I could just see that I had wounded you. And it honestly, Caleb, it kind of haunted me the rest of the week. And I broached the subject with you, I think, at your next lesson. And I asked you what was going on. Can you share that?
Yes, and looking back at it, I'm just so thankful that you brought it up, because I remember that it was something that hurt me quite a bit, in the sense of I can tell that there were so many external factors that were causing like the decline of the piece as it went on, because I was so used to just practicing the piece in a specific way. And I don't think I'd ever mindfully focus on the specifics of the piece. So then in communicating that, the rhythms of it and the flow of it, with the first time of me singing this piece for you and with the first time of me performing with a new pianist all in one, it just was a completely negative snowball effect that just led to a showcase of an unprepared performance, even though I knew that I had prepared way more than what was being showcased in that moment.
Yeah, so I'll say to you now what I said to you then, and that is, I'm sorry that I made an assumption about your preparedness, and I honestly was not very mindful in that moment, and I let my own anxiety about your recital, because teachers get anxious about their students' recitals. I let my own anxiety get in the way, and I made assumptions about where you were in your process rather than kind of asking you. And so that was a really great teaching moment for me. And so I thank you for the grace you offered me to kind of have that conversation. I really appreciate that.
We're human. We're going to make mistakes because we're not always at our best. I didn't even raise my voice to Caleb, but that didn't matter. I still created hurt feelings because I made assumptions rather than being present enough to ask Caleb about his process. Being able to acknowledge our mistakes and work toward a reconciliation is very important, a topic of an episode to come, to be sure. But how can we be proactive? How can we ensure that, to the best of our ability, these kinds of moments don't happen? When I talk about self-care, I'm not referring to what some might call a hippy-dippy, feel-good sort of moment. The kind of attitude minimizes the impact of what we do and the necessary steps we need to take to remain healthy, boundaried, mindful teachers. Catherine J. Denial beautifully emphasizes the kind of self-care we need to be practicing in chapter 1 of her book, A Pedagogy of Kindness. She writes, "We badly need a vision and practice of self-care that heals, especially in academia. Especially in an academia that continues to be hostile to so many of us along axes of race, gender, sexuality, religion, nationality, citizenship, disability, and class. We need a self-care that shouts when fields run too fast, demanding fealty to accelerating timetables of achievement, requiring that we prove our worth based on a handful of narrowly identified artifacts. We need a self-care that allows us to sustainably make demands of our institutions, demands that place our well-being at the center of everyday operations, strategic planning, and crisis response. We need a self-care that is not complicit in circumstances that create suffering for others. We do need, in Notting's words, affection and regard, but we need those concepts applied in their broadest, most political sense. We need to pause and to breathe and to be truthful about the academy in which we work." Love that quote. So let's talk a little bit about the ways to practice self-care. I feature some of these in chapter 3 of my book. First, meditation can be a great way to start. In a 2018 essay entitled Cultivating Reflective Teaching Practice Through Mindfulness, researchers note that mindfulness can minimize a focus on self-efficacy, keeping the student's needs at front and center, allowing a teacher to develop reflective practices such as reading somatic cues of a student's engagement or frustration, and maintaining connection with our humanity, encouraging students to access their own humanity. One of my favorite meditations is led by Tara Brach. It's called the Reign of Self-Compassion. RAIN is an acronym standing for recognize what's happening, allow the experience to be there, investigate with interest and care, and nurture with self-compassion. Brach quotes the words of Indian sage Bapuji, who wrote, "Break your heart no longer. Each time you judge yourself, you break your own heart." I know that I can sometimes be quick to judgment, both about things that I and others have done. I found that this meditation practice is very helpful in widening my proverbial lens, so I don't see things just from my own perspective. You'll find the Reign of Self-Compassion on YouTube. Journaling can be useful. A 2022 documentary entitled Stutz features Phil Stutz, who shares positive impacts on journaling. He says, "Nobody knows what's in their unconscious until they activate it. And one trick to do that is writing. It's a really magical thing. If you start to write, the writing is like a mirror. It reflects what's going on in your unconscious. And things will come out if you write in journal form that you didn't know that you knew." In a 12-week trial of general medical patients, researchers discovered that participants who took part in positive affect journaling, which is an emotion-focused self-regulatory intervention, found, quote, less disruptive symptoms and anxiety after 1 month, and a greater resilience after the first and second months, unquote. I've personally found journaling to be a very helpful tool, and I'll explain how in just a moment. Next, setting healthy boundaries is helpful. Laura Vandernoot Lipsky writes, "Many people get hooked on being involved in others' lives, solving their problems, becoming a powerful figure for them, getting increasingly attached to the feeling of being needed and useful. We need to acknowledge the value of what we bring without making our work about us." Damn, every time I read that, it hits me like a ton of bricks. Listen to that again. We need to acknowledge the value of what we bring without making our work about us. So, how can we set healthy, fluid boundaries in our teaching practice to make sure we keep grounded and center the student's journey? That's one of the many subjects tackled by Harriet L. Schwartz, who wrote the fantastic book Connected Teaching. She recommends teachers ask themselves the following questions with regard to reflexive boundaries. What boundaries have I set reflexively? What assumptions underlie those boundaries? Does setting these boundaries contribute to students' growth and development? Do these assumptions still ring true or make sense in the current context? And would adjusting these boundaries disrupt my self-care? I talked to Harriet about boundaries in episode 9. I want to recommend it to you. We had a fantastic time talking about that. And look, there are so many other ways to practice self-care, but I just want to leave you with one final one for now, and that's developing a healthy work-life balance. In a 2019 article for The Atlantic, author Derek Thompson argues that workism is making people miserable. He further suggests that the whiter the collar, the more susceptible the individual is to trying to show their value, the value of their work. And I think that could easily describe us in the voice community, right? So how can we go about creating a better work-life balance? Can we move from seeing a workaholic status as a badge of honor to celebrating time away from work so we can return to it with a new perspective? Over the last couple of years, I have developed a daily self-care routine that usually works for me. As soon as I wake up, I meditate for 10 to 15 minutes. I then, 5 times a week, will either go to the gym or run. Getting in my body tends to quiet my overactive brain. And once I get back from my exercise, I can start my day. Now, each day I teach at NYU, I leave early so I can walk from 14th Street to school, taking in parts of the West Village and Greenwich Village. I then leave time, like 5 to 10 minutes, to sit in Washington Square Park, one of my favorite places to sit. And I do this no matter the time of year. And I do this to be present with my surroundings. I love the steeple of Judson Memorial Church. And every time I look at it, I'm reminded of the spring I went to Florence. I love watching the squirrels play and spar for food, and I breathe. And then I'm able to start my teaching day. At the end of the day, I usually have a 45 to 60 minute commute home. Thank you, MTA. And during that time, I stream of consciousness journal, like Phil Stutz mentioned. I try to process things that I dismissed or didn't have time to think about when I was teaching. I may journal about my day, something that went well, something that annoyed me, something that was happening on the subway. I just try to let it rip, whatever I can get out of my system, so by the time I get home, I'm present for my husband. And he will be the first one to tell you that that doesn't always work. But again, these things are a practice for a reason. We are not always going to do them perfectly. Some nights I may decide I shouldn't watch television, but read instead, as a way of kind of bringing my energy down after a busy day. I've been rereading the short stories of Anne Lamott. I love her. And then I will, before I go to bed, I'll usually meditate from 10 to 20 minutes again, just to kind of clear my brain as much as I can before I go to sleep. So that's kind of my day-to-day routine. In addition, I keep my weekends clear, or as much as clear as I can. I limit weekend night events. And my husband and I try to find 2 weekends that we can leave the city, even if it's for a couple hours. And one of those weekends we'll go away for like 3 days just to really hit the reset button. I also love baking and walks to the farmer's market with my good friend Kim, and time with my amazing, amazing community of friends. They all ground me. That's what seems to work for me on most days. Now, I'm sure that there will be some sleepless nights in my future, but I'll try to keep showing up and working on this kind of self-care throughout the semester. Oh, and just a quick word here about gratitude. When I first moved to New York City, I was hired to sing in the professional choir at Marble Collegiate Church, the home of Reverend Norman Vincent Peale, who penned the book, The Power of Positive Thinking. Peale's predecessor was Dr. Arthur Caliandro, who was equal parts dynamic and compassionate. He delivered a sermon one Sunday that has stayed with me for over 20 years. He talked about witnessing a lake in Maine turning dazzling gold from the sunset one summer evening. He had to go to pick up his son by boat when his shift was done, and he was eager to get into that lake. In Dr. Caliandro's words, "I couldn't wait to get into the boat and be in that golden sea. I ran down the 82 steps to the beach, pulled the dinghy to the water, and as quickly as I could, rowed out to the boat, started the engine, and said to myself, I am going to go slowly and enjoy every minute of this ride. I gently nudged the throttle and proceeded slowly, but the gold was elusive. It was still ahead of me. To be in the gold, I went a little faster. Still not reaching the gold, I increased the speed, but to no avail. Frustrated, I opened the throttle to full speed. I was skimming across the bay at 35 miles an hour, as fast as the boat would go, and I still couldn't catch the gold. It was most unsettling for me. And then I did something I almost regretted. I turned to look behind me. What a shock! The sky was not gold. It was dark black and blue, and the sea reflected the same. I turned back, and there was the gold again. Back and forth I went, and I was really upset. When I returned home to the cottage, I described the experience to my wife. She said, "That's interesting. I stood on the bank and watched you cross the bay and said to myself, isn't Arthur lucky to be on that golden sea?" Then she said, "Arthur, you were in the gold. You were completely surrounded by the gold, and you didn't even know it." Always gets me. Even in the presence of annoyances, frustration, exhaustion, and even catastrophe, we may still be surrounded by gold. When I'm in my feelings, I know it's best for me to think about all the things that are going well in my life. And it may not solve the issue at hand, but it sure helps put it into proper perspective. So, what sets you off? What stresses you out? And what are some of the ways that you practice self-care so you don't find yourself reacting to those triggers? Sound off. You can email me at wholeheartedvoicepedagogy@gmail.com, or you can find me on the socials. My handle on most platforms is at Sisco Songs or at Wholehearted Voice Pedagogy. And look, you've made it this far, so why not subscribe and encourage others to do so as well? I have some really cool guests lined up in the next couple months, and you are not going to want to miss some of our conversations. More soon. Take care of you. I mean it.